Um, I'm very pleased to be introducing my next door neighbor in my nearby condo, Nandita Bajaj. I don't know if she's, as you can see up there, she's the executive director of a US nonprofit called Population Balance. If you've never heard of them, I recommend you go home and look up their very impressive website with all kinds of links to things, including their podcast, which Nandita hosts, 2 podcasts now, I learned. So goodness, how should I don't want to take too much time. When I first moved into the condo 8 years ago, and Nandita and her husband, Mike, followed pretty soon after, Nandita was teaching at UTS. And after a while, I learned that she had left teaching and was teaching in a much wider realm, and connected with a nonprofit where she got to travel and do all kinds of interesting things, including at some point she's become adjunct faculty in Antioch University. But it was only when a group of us gathered on the roof during last spring's eclipse and had a lot of time to chat while we were waiting for something to happen, like the clouds to part, that I learned what she really does now. And I thought, wow, this is someone that could come and talk to senior college. And she was extremely excited about the possibility of doing that. So her title today is Connecting the Dots Between Reproductive Autonomy and Environmental Sustainability. And the underlying subject of population size and not encouraging everybody to have more children has been very much in the press recently, not only in the US election with J.D. Vance's outrageous accusation that Democrats were all childless cat ladies, and the Republicans and the Democrats rejoinder that look at Kamala, her stepchildren stepped up and said, hang on, families, there are all kinds of families, multiracial, multi-faith, multi-parents, and we think Kamala's the best stepmother we could possibly have. So it's all been a lot of debate around this topic, and I will step away now and welcome Nandita to talk about some of the science and research behind the different sides of this debate. Okay, Nandita.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. Yes. And can I just minimize this fully? Okay, great. Yeah, it's really an honor for me to be here. I was very excited when Sara asked me, and of course the conversation we were having when Sara said, I think you should come and speak, is we were looking out from her terrace above the 6th floor out onto the streets of Toronto. And all we saw was construction everywhere. And Sara said, why is there so much construction all the time? And I said, well, I happen to be studying this area. And I can tell you why, because our governments seem really obsessed with the concept of growth and this ideology of growthism, growth at all costs, without understanding whether that growth is helping any of the people or nature involved. So that's where this conversation began. And today's topic, as Sara said, is connecting the dots between reproductive autonomy and environmental sustainability, but it's going to go into so many more things. This was just, an introduction to the topic. So briefly, my background is actually, before I got into all of this work, I grew up in India until I was 17. My family and I moved here 26 years ago. And I was really interested in studying engineering, specifically airplanes. And I was very excited about possibly flying airplanes. So I went to flight school. I studied that for a couple of years, and I was really, really good at the academics, but I was not very good at the actual execution of planes. So I decided that that was not for me, the actual flying of planes, because I actually didn't even have a driver's license when I was taking flight lessons. That might have had something to do with it. But I decided, well, at least I'm strong in math and science, so there's got to be something that connects my love for airplanes to my academic strength in those courses. And there's a field called aerospace engineering. So I went to Toronto Metropolitan University, previously called Ryerson, to study that. I worked at Bombardier Aerospace for a number of years. And I had a really good time while I was doing that, but I was also realizing that the field of engineering was so siloed, and we were not looking at any of the human-related issues. It was very focused on just making planes more efficient, reducing the noise, but we were not looking at, well, what about the emissions that come out of airplanes and travel? And how does that relate to, say, climate change? How does that relate to social inequalities, et cetera? Why weren't we talking about those things? So I left engineering to become a high school teacher to explore the connections between science and humanities. So I taught science, math, and physics for about 10 years. So a few of those I was at UTS, which many of you would be familiar with. And, I had really loved teaching, and I loved being with young people who were asking some of these bigger questions. And, one thing I realized that even within educational institutions, we were still not talking about some of the bigger things, is what can individuals do to minimize the impact that all of us were having on nature and on the larger world that was the home that we inherit. It's not simply earth and nature as resources, but really our what we inhabit. It's the lifeblood of our own existence. So then I went back to do my master's. I actually went to Antioch University, the Institute for Humane Education, where I majored in the connection between population, something that was very visceral to me growing up in the world's most populous nation, which now is. At the time when I was born, it was the second most populous nation, India. So for me, it was never out of sight, the fact that there were too many people. I knew what it was like to live in an overcrowded country. I was also interested in the decision on whether or not to have children, because at the time, in my late 20s, my partner and I were talking about this, and he's not Indian, he's Canadian, and he asked me when we were becoming serious what we thought about having children. And I said, well, don't we have to have kids? Isn't that a requirement? And he said, well, no, we can decide to do whatever we choose to do. We can have them or we cannot have them. And I was 28 years old. As I said, I was already an aerospace engineer. I was very independent in my thinking, and I never actually ever questioned this notion, especially having grown up in a really traditional culture, that, that I had a choice. And that's where the question of choice expanded for me. It's like, why did I never know growing up in India that this was a choice? Why did I never meet anyone who didn't have children? And for people who did, and did really want to become parents, how much choice did they have in when and with whom and how many children they had? So I was interested in making the connections between population, pronatalism, the pressure to have children, or this unwritten rule that one must have children or a certain number of children, and ecological sustainability, knowing what I was seeing all around me. And that's what led me to go back to school to study this. And then soon after, I became the executive director of this organization, Population Balance, where I brought this lens of looking at human rights, animal protection, and environmental sustainability all together, which is what humane education means. So today's outline, I will talk about, well, how did we become the dominant species on planet Earth when there are so many other incredible species? And when we are one of the animals that happen to inhabit Earth. Then I'll speak about how population discourse kind of disappeared from academia and mainstream culture over the last several decades. If anything we hear about population today is the idea of that our population is collapsing. A lot of folks, especially people like Elon Musk, are saying things like population collapse is a greater threat to humanity than global warming, climate change, or species extinction. That seems really bizarre, seeing that we're at 8 billion now, and we're expected to add another 2.5 billion. We don't seem to be running out of people. So, why has there been such silence around population? So I'll speak about that. And then I'll come back to what do we need to do as progressive, rights-based thinkers to bring the population connection back into the discourse so we can actually move forward in a world that is more sustainable, more just for everyone, humans and non-humans alike. So for human expansionism, I'm going to start with a graph I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. This goes back 10,000 years. We have been around for a lot longer than 10,000 years. We've actually been around for 250 to 300,000 years. And for most of our history, we lived as hunter-gatherers. But the reason 10,000 years is significant is because that was after the last ice age, and we started to engage in what's known as the agricultural revolution, where we went from hunter-gatherer to settlement societies over the period of thousands of years that it took. Agricultural revolution, I'm going to come back to this period in a few slides. So I'd like to just make sure we remember 10,000 years ago is when we started engaging in this. And that involved the domestication of animals and plants to provide us with food and sustenance, etc. Number of millennia later, believe this, the elites who had started to create states and empires began with the surplus of food. There was this demand for having more people. And that is where I'll go deeper into this. The pressure to have more people really first came into being. Is we need more people to sustain our empires. We need more people to become soldiers to protect those empires. And that's where a lot of what I call pronatalism really began, institutionalized. But really, not much was happening, as you can see, in terms of growth. It was very, very minimal. It's 1800 when we landed upon cheap, abundant energy, fossil fuels, that led to an explosion in human population, where it went from 1 billion, which it took us 200 to 300,000 years to get to the first billion people. And then in just 200 years, we went from 1 billion to 8 billion. projected to go another 2 billion additional. So this is known to many ecologists. They would call this an anomaly, an aberration in terms of species. And there has been no species above us that has been able to keep us in check. So with advancements in technology and with continued access to abundant, cheap energy with fossil fuels, we've been able to just explode at the peril of the biophysical basis of our existence, right? We've completely demolished so many other species and nature. But this obviously cannot go on for too long, as we are seeing nature is responding with all sorts of limits to how we can continue to do this. So I'm going to play a short 1-minute clip by an ecological economist, Dr. William Rees. Some of you may be familiar with his name. He is he's an emeritus from University of British Columbia. And he's the one who came up with the concept of the ecological footprint or ecological overshoot in terms of popularizing that idea. So here he's speaking about the last 200 years from 1 billion to 8 billion, what we've done.
I think it's really interesting to look historically at this whole question of growth, because for all intents and purposes, there was none for 250,000 years. In just the last 200 years, we've seen more change than in the previous entire history of human beings. Only 10 generations of human beings out of thousands have experienced this phenomenon of growth. Growth in population, growth in technology, in sufficient quantity so that they would notice in the course of their lifetimes. And so it's really a very, very recent phenomenon. But because all of us alive today and for the past few generations have been embedded within this growth dynamic, we take it to be the norm. And therefore, we project ourselves into the future as if it can continue forever. But the fact is that this is the single most abnormal period in human history. It's completely unprecedented, never occurred before, and can never occur again.
And so I'll be showing a couple more clips with Dr. Rees, but he, as I said, was the person who came up with the idea of ecological footprint, and connected to the concept of ecological footprint is ecological overshoot. When we have overshot the carrying capacity of Earth for our own species, and every species has a carrying capacity, what nature can sustainably provide that species, sustainably meaning indefinitely. And we, at this point, are demanding 75% more from Earth than Earth can sustain. And so you can see that this is not sustainable because we are eating right out of our, what is all, you can look at it as principal, our principal amount, or living off of a credit card, or we're stealing resources basically from other species, but also from our future generations. So children and grandchildren who will not have access to the same nature that we have had access to. It'll be much more degraded, and we're already seeing that. And in the last 200 years, as the population grew in size from 1 billion to 8 billion by a factor of 8, what's another part of the equation is our consumption, the way we are consuming and the distribution of that consumption around the world. Our consumption in just the last 200 years grew by a factor of 100 compared to how we have lived for millennia. So I'm going to show a short video. This gentleman is Dr. Matthijs Wackernagel. He and Dr. Bill Rees together wrote a book called Our Ecological Footprint in the 90s. And he was a student of Dr. Rees, and now he runs an organization, started an organization called the Global Footprint Network. So you might be familiar with that.
The ecological footprint is an accounting tool, not for money, but for ecological resources. So it compares how much nature we have and how much nature we use. Over the last 40 years, we've just had one planet. That's why the line of supply is very, very horizontal. Humanity has been continuously increasing its resource demand, to the extent that by the 70s we started to use more than what nature can regenerate. Currently, we're using at least 50% more than what nature can renew. This means it takes about 1 year and 6 months to regenerate what people use in 1 year. So we are in global overshoot.
Overshoot can be thought of as living off of your credit card. You know, humanity's living off its ecological credit card. If we use more than nature can keep up with, we actually start to erode natural capital that life depends on.
Currently, if everyone on Earth lived as North Americans do, we'd need 4 Earths. For everyone to live as Europeans do would take 2.5 Earths. In other regions, people are living beyond the capacity of 1 Earth as well. China and India are presently living just around the 1 Earth level. But given the rapid industrialization and economic growth of both countries, that's sure to change.
A key component of humanity's ecological footprint is the burning of fossil fuels. The carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere is causing the Earth's surface to heat up, disrupting global climate patterns. In a series of comprehensive reports, the largest group of scientists ever assembled on a single issue has warned that unless we act now, it is extremely likely that climate change will have devastating impacts on the future of life on Earth.
So you'll see that this video is actually from 2014, 10 years ago. And they said, if everyone lived like an average American, we would need 4 planets. And they said India and China that were rapidly industrializing are also going to go beyond the 1 Earth that they showed 10 years ago. So now I'm going to show you where we're really at 10 years later. So an average American now uses 5 Earths. So the consumption per capita has gone up. China has more than doubled in its consumption rates. What this graphic also shows is the inequitable distribution of resources globally. And that's partly why people are sometimes afraid to say that it's population that's an issue. Many people will say it's actually consumption of the rich countries that's causing a lot of the problems. We like to say that it's both. It's not either or. As more and more people are being added to the planet, they desire a high standard of living, as they want to, as they should. So this inequitable distribution obviously is a really important issue that we need to address, so that, you know, people don't need to live way, way beyond their means in terms of how much they're consuming. There's an idea of you can have prosperity, but you don't need that much stuff to be happy. And at the same time, if you see, there are some people in the world who are living in really poor conditions, and that's also not acceptable. So how do we balance out the consumption needs around the world, but also think about how population factors in? So as I said, people would say, is it population or really it's consumption? But it's a false dichotomy. It is both of those things, because as we saw, we're already demanding 75% from the planet as a whole humanity. Earth doesn't care that we are inequitably distributed in terms of our resources. All Earth cares about is it's dying, and all the other species that care about is they're being pushed off the planet. So as human beings, we have to care about social justice and making sure there's equitable distribution. But even if there were an equitable distribution of what I showed, we're still 75% in overshoot. That means we need to pull back the demand as well. In fact, when they talked about India and China industrializing quite quickly, you will see that 88% of the next billion people who will be entering into the middle class, and the middle class being what an average American or average Canadian would live like. So having access to a car or multiple cars, taking flights, eating meat, heavy diets, etc. So that's what middle class would mean. And you can see here, the size of the US population is 380 million, I think. That is a fraction of India's population. India is 1.4 billion. That is a fraction of India's population that is now entering the middle class. That is the size of one America. There's another America that we've just added in terms of people who are living like average Americans. So it's important to see that this is a global phenomenon now. Of course, there's rich countries and poor countries, but more and more poorer countries are rising into the middle class, and that is an issue, right? Consumption patterns are actually going up, not down. So why is it so hard to talk about population? And maybe for you it isn't. It's the circles I deal with. There is a real issue. You cannot bring up population. Some people think it's pointing fingers at high fertility countries, or that it's racist to talk about population. And I think there's good reason for people to be worried about that, because in the past there have been people who have used that line of thinking, that if only people in those countries stop having so many children, we wouldn't have this issue, without understanding what's going on at the root causes of these issues. So there is good reason, but also there are a lot of bad reasons why people don't talk about it, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So we at Population Balance have focused on three main reasons why population is not talked about, why we think we can keep growing. And one of them is this idea of human supremacy or human exceptionalism, that somehow we are more deserving than any other species to dominate the earth, to take over the resources, and that we are special, and that more people is better. So, and the other two that I'll talk about is past policies. There were some really horrible policies that were instituted to try and prevent people from having children against their own autonomy. And that has obviously caused a lot of nervousness around talking about this. And the third one is my area of research, which is pronatalism, which is pressures that are put on people, especially women, to have children, not for what they want, but for external demographic goals, whether it is religious, whether it is economy or nationalism, things that have nothing to do with the women, families, or the children involved. So human supremacy, one definition of it is from my colleague, Dr. Eileen Christ. It's a worldview that esteems the human as a distinguished entity that is superior to all other life forms and is entitled to use them and the places they live. So that's one definition. And that also is at play when people say, well, Earth was not enough, now we need to colonize Mars. It's still very much us. We are the only ones that matter. That's the kind of mentality that is at play. Now, when I interviewed Dr. Bill Rees, I asked him what he thought was at the root of human exceptionalism, and that's what he's answering here.
Sure. I think it's really important to emphasize something that you've alluded to here, and that is that human beings are storytellers. We don't live in reality the way other species do. We make up stories, and then we live out of those confections as if they were the real thing. And exceptionalism, the word you used, is one of those stories. So it's a philosophical concept, I suppose, with deep roots in religion, but it subscribes to the belief that human beings are outside of nature. We're not like other organisms. Many people don't like to think of themselves as animals, for example. And once you've developed a story that puts you outside of nature, then clearly you are, I suppose, liberated from the laws of nature, biophysics, physics, and so on and so forth. So here we are, a species that is unique in the world as far as we know, in that it considers itself to be not part of the system of which it is deeply a part. So the story deviates enormously from the reality. And I think that's a major source of many of our problems.
And the way it shows up, the concept of human supremacy, is that you can see over the last several hundred years, as human population has increased, so has the rate of extinction of other species. And I'll show you a few other slides that show exactly how that has panned out. So there are several drivers of species extinction: agriculture and logging, hunting and fishing, and human development. Agriculture and logging show up through, the biggest way in which species are being pushed out is the amount of earth that is needed, not to sustain us, our physical bodies, because our physical bodies don't take up that much space on earth. It's the earth that is needed to grow food to sustain us. So currently 50% of habitable land is being used to grow food for us. Of that 50%, a good chunk of that, 70% of that, is being used for animal agriculture. And so both of those, especially animal agriculture, is also a really big cause of greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to climate change, more than, say, all of the transportation that produces greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So that is driving, because if we're using 50% of habitable land, that means all of the species who see that land as their home, that's their habitat, have to be pushed aside in order to make room for us to grow food. There's also hunting, poaching, and fishing. Sometimes it's for food, but other times it's for superstitious reasons. People around the world have ideas around, what certain body parts can do for their own healing or medicinal use. And sometimes you just, as we know, body parts are used to make things for selling to humans, like tusks for, piano keys, for instance. And then, of course, human development is a huge cause of habitat fragmentation, where we're just building highways and roads that cross straight through species habitats. And we are seeing more and more wildlife come into urban areas, and we see them as pests or nuisance, but they were there a long time before we came around, and we now see them as pests, like they're coming into our homes, never realizing for a second that we built roads where they were living. It was their home first. And then, of course, they are killed off, removed, etc. So remember, I said we're going to come back to that period after the last ice age 10,000 years ago, when we started domesticating animals. So right now, if you look at all of the mass, the weight of all the vertebrates on Earth, 60% of all animals by mass are actually livestock. 36% are us, and only 4% is wild. Only 4% is wild. 10,000 years ago, before we started domesticating animals, so that means, there was none of this. We may have been hunting, but we were hunting animals that were living in the wild. Right up until the moment of their death, they were living as they would. So we didn't have this. So my question is, before we began domesticating animals 10,000 years ago, what do you think the percentage of humans versus wild was, knowing that this was 0? So 100% divided between humans and wild. What do you think the numbers might have been? Any wild guesses? Yeah. It was. Exactly. We were only 1% of the rich biodiverse planet. We were, of course, still a special species as far as we think, but there were 99% of the rest of the species were wild. So you can see what we've done as one species dominated over the entire planet, and what we've done to the other wild species. So the second area of why population is so difficult to talk about is past policies. So when population became more prominent in mainstream discourse, I think especially in the late 60s with Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, and the Limits to Growth study that came out of the Club of Rome, both of those really heightened the awareness that people had about population, even though population had been growing for 50, 60 years or 100 years preceding that. But really, that's when people started talking, countries started discussing, and this is after the Second World War. So you can see there was a lot of, rejigging and reimagination happening of how do we come back from that. And there were a lot of policies that were put into place that were actually empowering policies that got to the heart of why was population growing. Population was growing because a lot of girls and women in general didn't have access to education. There were pressures, patriarchal pressures from, different, whether it was religious, whether it was tradition, that compelled people to have lots of children. And sometimes it was driven by this notion that children are wealth and we need more hands to help with the farm, etc. So most of the policies were this kind, and it led to incredible reduction in the fertility rates because people had greater choice, especially women had greater choice to have fewer children. But there were outliers to this norm, and there were policies like China's one-child policy. Everyone knows about China's one-child policy because it was so brutal in so many ways. It engaged in forced abortions, forced fines on people who had more than one child. A lot of children ended up being abandoned because of it, because people couldn't afford the fines. And it really had a kind of reverberating effect on the world because it involves so much coercion. The reason China had to put that policy into place because of the risk of losing, 500 million people to famine at the time. That's what they were struggling with. But while China put a coercive policy into place, there were other countries at the same time who put empowering policies in place, like Iran, like Costa Rica, like Morocco, so many other examples, which ended up having the same effect that China did with its policy, except after, realizing it didn't need to do coercion. You see how fertility rates throughout the world over the last 60, 70 years came down, not because of coercion, but because of empowerment. When people were given education, family planning, counseling, and access, and choice. So China was one example. There was also a policy in India a few years before I was born, where a lot of people, especially poor people, were forced or compelled into becoming sterilized. And they, they were bribed in a way to say, you should stop having kids because, and we'll give you some money because this is leading to a lot of issues. Not once realizing that coercion should have never been the answer, because if you didn't realize why people were having so many children in the first place, was because of a lack of information, lack of access. And by not addressing that issue, it actually really tainted the whole topic of population. And a lot of people thought talking about population automatically means that you're going to take away rights from people and you're telling people you shouldn't be having so many kids. But it was never really about telling people. What a lot of people do not realize that efforts to lower birth rates over the last 50, 60 years, they fade in comparison to efforts to increase birth rates over thousands of years. There has been so much pressure to grow the population from so many different stakeholders that we often don't talk about. And this is where we interviewed a science journalist who recently wrote a book called The Patriarchs, kind of how these states and empires came to be about 5,000 years ago, and how growing population was a central part of national strength. A nation is strong when it has a lot of people. Today, it shows up in the form of economic growth. A nation is strong if it has a great big economy. Economic growth relies on population growth. We need more consumers, more taxpayers, et cetera. So here, Angela Saini describes how pronatalism, this pressure for children, came to be.
The idea of a gender division of labor is actually a relatively recent one. The big turning point comes with the emergence of the first states. That's at least where we can see it in the record very clearly. You can imagine in those very early states, what were the big concerns of the elites who were trying to form those states? Obviously, population must have been very high up that agenda, because if you're creating a society in which you need people to create a surplus for those at the top, in which you need people to be available to defend the state and die for it if necessary, then you need people. They are the number one valuable commodity right throughout history. So, of course, over these thousands of years, you see pressure fall on young women to have as many children as possible, which in hunter-gatherer societies, otherwise they do not do. And also pressure falls on young men to be available to defend the state.
And you can see both pronatalism, pressure to have children, and militarism, pressure to join the army, are still very much present in current time, even though we see ourselves as, more progressive than we were 5,000 years ago.
The idea of
and then the last one that it brings me to the topic of pronatalism, this pressure to have children. And as Angela Saini says, there are these institutional policies or pressures that compel people to have more children for external goals. The contemporary form of that looks like an author, Laura Carroll, writes, in today's day and age, the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life is what pronatalism is. It's a strong social force that includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they've come to be seen as true. Now, it's challenging pronatalism is not challenging parenthood. It's challenging the ideology that tells us that parenthood must be the path for everybody. And a lot of that ideology stems from institutionalized messaging that's come from states and religion that tell you if you don't have children, you're committing a sin, or the purpose of marriage is to have children, or that you, it's an honorary thing that you do, honorable thing that you do for the state if you give the state children because it's helping the state. Or in current mainstream outlets, as Sarah pointed out, there's a lot of panic that fertility rates are declining and that our economies are going to crash if we don't keep the population growing. And there's all of the scheming going on, is like, why aren't women having more children? What can we do to promote baby making, right? And that is now the contemporary form of what pronatalism looks like, is we're saying we need more babies for the economy. Nobody is questioning, well, why do we need a bigger economy? Shouldn't the economy be there to serve its citizens? And if you need a bigger economy, then you need more people. Nobody's better off if everything is growing. We're, much more bankrupt when it comes to nature and access to nature. So pronatalist pressures show up in a number of ways. There's cultural pressures from family, from tradition, from relatives, where, say, a woman who's unable to have children, say because of physiological reasons, can be subject to divorce, economic marginalization. She can be subject to domestic violence, because depending on especially how traditional the community is, because there's this notion that your only purpose is to produce children. And, it can have all these consequences. And in current day, we're seeing the far right, especially in the US and a lot of countries, you're seeing this denigration of people who don't have children, like the phrase childless cat ladies, or, they don't have, people without children don't have a stake in the future, as if you only care about the future after you have children, as if you can't care about Earth, without children. And so I'll show you a slide in a second of, how it's showing up around the world, but there's pressure for more followers. So many religions around the world encourage large families, pressure from corporations, contractors who are looking for more consumers. And then political pressures, whether it's for a greater number of taxpayers, a larger military, or ethnocentrism. They want more people of their own kind rather than, say, migrants or migration. This is a lighthearted clip from a Toronto filmmaker, Teresa Schechter, and she, she's from Eastern Europe. She grew up her parents are from Eastern Europe, and there was a lot of pressure on her to have children. She decided she didn't want to have children, but then she became really interested, kind of like me, to understand, why is it such a taboo decision for people to not have children? Reproductive choice should be available to everyone. Parenthood and non-parenthood should be equally legitimate choices that are available to everyone. But somehow, when people don't have children, there is a real stigma around that, exactly. Or whether you couldn't have children or whether you chose to not have children. So here she created a film called My So-Called Selfish Life, and this is a short trailer.
Nobody doesn't want kids.
People cannot want kids. It's a thing.
That is not a thing.
Well, it's my thing.
I've known since high school that I did not want to be a mother.
At one point, you just declared that if I ever want to have grandchildren, don't look at me.
I didn't really ever want kids, but I always assumed I would have them.
I kept asking myself, is this gonna happen to me? Does it have to happen?
What does it mean to live in a world where motherhood is our destiny? And what happens if we say no?
Remember, your biological clock is ticking.
I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby.
Do you have a biological clock?
Not ticking within me, so the answer would have to be no.
There's no biological reason for that to happen. You could list any number of honors and degrees, and somebody will still think that you're not fully accomplished if you haven't had a child.
Motherhood has increased in value yet again. It's almost fetishized in our society.
This is the real solution to climate change. Babies.
Nations need childbirth.
Babies are good for the economy.
This is by design, this life. I'm not missing anything. I didn't forget to have kids. I'm just not interested.
To have somebody tell you you don't know what's best for you is extremely condescending and insulting.
Never question my African identity because I'm child-free.
You can be an aunt or an uncle to your friends' children, and you'll be fine. In fact, you'll be great.
Don't forget to take your pill. I won't.
So it's wonderful that, you know, films like this, they are becoming more and more popular, especially in a mainstream culture that is so obsessed with pronatalism. You need all sorts of approaches. You need serious approaches and you need humorous approaches to counteract some of the messages coming from the right. And so these are examples of what different countries are doing. You know, Iran is a country that was one of the exemplars during the 50s and 60s, 70s, to have put in family planning policies that empowered people, that encouraged, you know, women to go to school and have other aspirations. And it had incredible decline in fertility for, you know, within, I think, a decade or two, the fertility rate in Iran came from an average of 6 children per woman to less than 2, really fast, faster than China's one-child policy. And now, like so many countries, Iran is so freaked out that women are too empowered and not having as many kids that their national strength is decreasing. So these are the kinds of things they're doing, is ending provision by state of contraceptive access, vasectomy access. Turkey's pushing for 3 children incentive. In Hungary, if you have 4 babies, but only for Hungarian people, not for people who are not native Hungarians, and you also have to be a heterosexual married couple for this to be available, you pay no income tax for life. So I wonder how many people here would consider that to have no tax. And then Putin, of course, has brought in this award called the Mother Heroine Award for women who will have 10 children for the nation. Right? And and it comes with prize money. It's like 1 million rubles, which ends up being like $6,000, I think. But it's really, really small. But these are things that have been done in the past for, you know, thousands of years. And now we are seeing them come back with a vengeance, because for the first time in our history, we're seeing fertility rates decline due to greater choice, greater autonomy, greater empowerment. So what do I have next? Another thing here is we have to recognize globally, half of all pregnancies are unintended. So when nations take away access to contraceptives and put in all sorts of bans, like abortion bans, you can see how many unwanted, unintended pregnancies result from that. Today, almost 750 million women and girls alive were child brides. So that's a huge part of the total female population of, say, 4 billion. So almost a quarter of female population were married as children. There are over 200 million women who would like to avoid the next pregnancy, but do not have access to modern contraception. Sometimes it's not just a matter of availability, it's the taboo surrounding access, the taboo surrounding use of contraceptives. If your family members or if your husband finds out that you're on contraceptives, you can be beaten up, you can be punished. Sometimes if women are have a shot, Depo-Provera, or any kind of a contraceptive shot, there's this taboo around, well, why are you using contraceptives? Are you sleeping around? Why would you need to use contraceptives if you're only having sex with your husband? Because that should always lead to children, and children are a blessing. So there's all sorts of psychological and cultural barriers. It's not just access. You could have free contraceptives available and people will not touch it because of the taboo or stigma within different cultures. So remember, I showed this graph earlier, is, for the first time in our history, really, because of greater choice, we are seeing fertility rates around the world declining. They're nowhere close to where they should be for us to get to a more sustainable population size. In fact, our population, so I'll come back to this in a second, our population is still growing. Our growth rate is lower, the rate at which population growing is lower, but population size absolutely is still growing. So in 1970, our population was half of what it is today, 4 billion. And we were growing at a rate of 2%, meaning we were adding 80 million people each year to the planet. Today, we are double the size at 8 billion, but our growth rate is 1%. But if you do the math, we're still growing in absolute numbers by the same amount, 80 million people a year. And because the growth rate is declining and fertility rates are declining, a lot of panic is, dictating our mainstream media, because people are unable to, I guess, do basic math that, a decline in growth rate does not mean a decline in population. It's like our population is still expected to grow or add another 2.5 billion people this century. So this kind of panic, you see someone like the chairman of the American Conservative Union, the folks who have been really behind the abortion bans in the United States, saying, if you say there's a population problem, meaning there aren't enough babies being born, but you're killing millions of your own children through legalized abortion every year, well, if abortion were to be reduced, some of that problem is solved. And guess what the United States has done? In order to solve the problem of fertility decline and women being too empowered, they've put in all sorts of abortion restrictions and even bans to coerce people to produce children for the state. In Hungary, the president, Viktor Orban, says we will defend Christian culture. We will not surrender the country to aliens. Instead of just numbers, we want Hungarian children. Migration for us is surrender. So you see, there's a lot of right Christian nationalism at play around the world. And sometimes it's just ethnocentrism. It could be a different religion that's pushing for the same arguments. So my final part, which is the shortest part, so I'm almost done, connecting the dots. We are seeing every single day in the news statements like this. Earth may have breached 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries. Global water crisis is fueling more conflicts. I think it's over 1 billion people, or maybe 2 billion people on Earth today are water insecure. Global heating will push billions outside of the human climate niche. So these will be people who are already living in impoverished conditions, who will become either climate refugees or who will simply die from extreme weather events. 1 billion out of the 2 billion children alive today are at extreme risk from climate impacts. And of course, collapsing wildlife populations near points of no return. So we're seeing all of this human and non-human suffering that's baked into our ecological catastrophe. And, you know, with that in the background, then you see something like this from Elon Musk. Population collapse due to birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. So dots are not being connected, right? Around, in terms of our political leaders who are panicking about fertility decline, to billionaires who want more people so they can have cheap labor, or they can send people to Mars to you know, whatever fantasies they have about that. These messages have power. These are people with large megaphones with a lot of money. Of course, Elon Musk has been also supporting the presidential campaign for Donald Trump. And he's also supporting a lot of other right-wing agendas around the world that are pushing people to having more children, even if that means through coercion, such as abortion bans. So this is a serious matter. And what makes me uncomfortable is that our politicians, liberal, progressive politicians, even in Canada, are talking about birth rate panic, that Canada's birth rate is declining too quickly. What can we do? Can we, you know, improve family leave? Can we improve fertility, access to fertility treatments, et cetera? All of those things should just be basic rights that people should have. Good family leave, good access to healthcare, not because we want to encourage more children, right? So what is a better way of thinking about this? First of all, Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN rapporteur that serves on the extreme poverty division of the UN, recently came out with an extremely impressive report, deep literature review that shows that economic growth does not lead to prosperity. It is not helping reach, trickle down people who actually are poor and need access. It's simply enriching elites. We interviewed him for our podcast last week. It should be coming out in another week if you want to listen in detail to his arguments. But we've also got leading ecologists and human rights folks who are saying slowing the growth, declining birth rates are actually a really good thing, and it does not need to mean an end to prosperity. So if we look at what is a sustainable population and consumption size, according to a lot of leading ecologists who study not just economy or demography, but they actually study Earth systems. Anywhere between 2 to 4 billion people is what is considered sustainable. Some would say that's way too many. It should be even lower than that. But 2 to 4 billion is something most of us can imagine. You know, some of these numbers in our lifetimes. We were at 4 billion in 1970. We were at 2 billion in 1926 or 28. My grandmother was born in 1926. And she's still alive. She's going to be almost 100. And in her lifetime, she's seen the population go from 2 billion. When she turned 50, it was 4 billion. At her 100th birthday, it's 8 billion. So in one person's lifetime, the population has exploded, which is really unprecedented. And so we can imagine this because many people have seen this number in our lifetime. And in the same way we've had growth, we can have contraction. especially if we were to put in a lot of focus on enhancing reproductive rights. And confronting pronatalism and all sorts of pressures that are being put. So I showed this trajectory earlier, that according to the middle trajectory, which is business as usual, we do nothing, we change nothing, we are projected to add 2.5 billion people, reaching 10.5 by the end of this century. But if we start preventing unintended pregnancies, cancel and abolish practices like child marriage, give everyone access to reproductive autonomy, access to contraceptive, family planning services, education, we could see a 0.5 point drop in total fertility rate. Just 0.5 drop leads to 3 to 4 billion fewer people. That's a tiny, tiny drop, which means we have so much in our favor that can work in our favor. If we were to enhance rights, we could get there. So I have some slides on how we can think differently about fertility, about economy, about the elderly population, but I'm happy to stop here and I can talk about those things during the Q&A. So I'm going to skip this stuff. And I've got lots of podcast episodes on different things, such as population denial, such as human supremacy and ecocentrism, leading ecologists, such as alternative economics. How do we think about economy in a way that leads to prosperity, not just to growth? And pronatalism and reproductive autonomy. So if anyone interested in going deeper into these issues, you can listen to the podcast, but I'm also really happy to answer questions now. Thank you so much for your time.